In this episode, we start by taking privacy principles out of the realm of slogans and putting them where they belong, which is inside the everyday decisions that shape how systems collect, use, share, and keep data. New learners often hear phrases like privacy by design and think they are describing a special project that happens once, or they hear words like consent and transparency and think they are only legal topics. On the CDPSE exam, privacy principles are treated as practical rules that guide engineering choices from the first idea of a feature to the final retirement of the system that supported it. The exam expects you to recognize which principle is relevant in a scenario, explain why it matters, and choose actions that make the principle real through controls and evidence. This is why principles matter so much. They are the logic behind the program, the design, and the operational behavior that people rely on. When you learn to apply principles end-to-end, you stop feeling like privacy is a set of separate requirements and start seeing it as a consistent way of building trustworthy systems. That consistency is what both the exam and real privacy engineering work are trying to measure. A strong way to learn privacy principles is to treat them as answers to a small set of repeated questions that show up in different forms. One question is purpose, meaning why data is collected and why it is used, because privacy expects the use to match legitimate, stated purposes. Another question is minimization, meaning whether you are collecting and using only what you need, because more data creates more risk and more opportunity for misuse. Another question is transparency, meaning whether people can understand what is happening with their data and whether they can make informed choices. Another question is control, meaning whether people have meaningful options, such as giving consent where required or exercising rights like access or deletion. Another question is accountability, meaning whether the organization can prove that it follows its principles through policies, records, and operational behavior. When you connect principles to these questions, you can handle unfamiliar scenarios because you have a stable mental model. The exam is often looking for that stable model because it produces consistent decisions instead of guesswork. If you can explain which question a principle is answering, you can usually identify the correct next step. Privacy by design, PBD, is a principle that can feel abstract until you see how it functions as a habit of building privacy into the way work is done, rather than adding fixes at the end. The core idea is that privacy should be considered from the beginning, embedded into design choices, and maintained through the lifecycle, instead of being treated as an afterthought. This shows up in decisions like choosing to collect less data at the start, setting privacy-friendly defaults, limiting access to those who truly need it, and planning retention and deletion before data accumulates. It also shows up in how teams work, such as including privacy review as part of normal approval gates and documenting decisions when trade-offs are made. The exam may test this by presenting a scenario where a team wants to launch a feature quickly, and you must choose the action that best embeds privacy early, such as scoping an assessment and aligning data collection to purpose before release. It may also test whether you avoid answers that sound like retroactive patches, because adding a policy after shipping does not equal building privacy into design. When you hear privacy by design, think early, embedded, repeatable, and lifecycle aware. Consent is one of the most misunderstood privacy concepts for beginners, partly because it sounds like a simple yes or no when it is actually a structured agreement that must be meaningful, informed, and respected. Consent matters because it can establish permission for certain types of processing, and it also creates an expectation that the organization must honor the choice consistently. The exam will often test whether you know that consent must be tied to specific purposes, not vague future possibilities, because people cannot meaningfully agree to unknown uses. It will also test whether you understand that consent is not always the appropriate basis for processing, because some processing may be necessary for a service or required by law, and framing everything as consent can create misleading expectations. Another key idea is that consent is not a one-time event, because the organization must keep records of what was agreed to, offer the ability to withdraw where appropriate, and ensure downstream systems respect the choice. If a user opts out of a marketing purpose, that choice must be reflected in systems that send messages, systems that build audiences, and systems that share data with partners. When consent is treated as a real control rather than a checkbox, it becomes a strong example of end-to-end principle application. Transparency is closely related to consent, but it has its own purpose. It ensures people are not surprised by how their data is handled and can understand the rules of the relationship. Transparency includes notices and explanations of what data is collected, why it is collected, how it is used, who it is shared with, how long it is kept, and what rights people have. The exam often tests transparency by presenting a situation where data is used in a new way, such as using account data to train analytics models and asking what should happen to remain compliant with expectations. A transparency-focused response might include updating notices, ensuring communications are clear, and aligning internal processing with what is communicated. Another important detail is that transparency must match reality, meaning it is not enough to publish a notice if actual system behavior does something different. If a notice says data is not shared, but a vendor receives it for processing, transparency has failed even if the intent was good. Transparency also extends into internal audiences, because employees and operators need to understand what they are allowed to do with personal information. When you apply transparency end-to-end, you treat it as continuous alignment between words and system behavior. Purpose limitation is a principle that becomes especially important in modern systems, where data collected for one reason is tempting to reuse for another. Purpose limitation means that once data is collected for a stated purpose, the organization should not use it for incompatible purposes without appropriate justification, notices, or changes in the lawful basis, depending on the context. The exam tests this by describing a new project that wants to use existing data and asking what should happen before that reuse occurs. A purpose limitation mindset would push you to define the new purpose, evaluate compatibility, assess risk, and implement controls that limit use to what is allowed. It also pushes you to avoid expanding data use quietly, because quiet expansion is a common real-world cause of privacy harm and regulatory attention. Purpose limitation connects naturally to data inventories and data flow thinking, because you cannot limit purpose if you do not know where data goes and how it is used. It also connects to vendor management, because if a vendor is processing data, the vendor must be limited to the purposes the organization has defined. When you see scenarios about repurposing data, purpose limitation should be one of your first mental anchors. Data minimization and proportionality are principles that are simple to say, but surprisingly challenging to apply consistently, which is why the exam tests them in practical ways. Minimization means collecting, using, and retaining only what is necessary to achieve a legitimate purpose, and it pushes you to design systems that do not gather extra data, just because it might be useful later. Proportionality adds the idea that the level of data collection and intrusiveness should match the need, meaning you do not collect highly sensitive information to solve a low-stakes problem. The exam might describe a registration flow that asks for more data than necessary, and the best response will usually involve reducing fields, making some data optional, or justifying why each field exists. Minimization also includes retention decisions, because keeping data longer than necessary is a form of collecting too much over time. It can also include limiting internal access, because broadly shared data is effectively more data than necessary. When you apply minimization end-to-end, you do not only reduce data at collection, you also reduce spread, reduce retention, and reduce reuse. Accuracy and data quality are sometimes overlooked as privacy principles, but they matter because wrong data can harm people and can lead to unfair or incorrect decisions. If a system stores outdated contact information, a person may miss important notices or have their requests mishandled. If a profile incorrectly labels someone, the person might be treated unfairly, such as being denied a benefit, flagged as risky, or targeted for messaging they do not want. The exam may test accuracy by focusing on processes that allow correction, verification, and quality controls, especially when data is used for decisions. Accuracy also ties to transparency, because if you tell people you use data to make decisions, you must be able to explain those decisions and ensure the underlying data is reliable. This principle pushes privacy engineering to consider how data is maintained, not just how it is collected. It also pushes organizations to avoid building complex systems on low-quality data, because that can create a chain of privacy harms that is hard to unwind later. When you study Remember that privacy is not only about secrecy, but also about correctness and fair treatment. Integrity and confidentiality are principles that overlap with security, but their privacy meaning is about protecting personal information from unauthorized or improper access, alteration, or exposure. Confidentiality supports privacy because if personal information is leaked, misused, or accessed without permission, people can be harmed and trust is damaged. Integrity supports privacy because if records are altered or corrupted, people may be misrepresented and rights requests may be handled incorrectly. The exam may include scenarios about access controls, logging, and safeguards, but it will often test whether you can connect those controls to privacy outcomes rather than treating them as generic security actions. For example, limiting access to personal information is not only about stopping attackers, it is also about preventing internal misuse or inappropriate curiosity. Logging is not only about security monitoring, it can be evidence that a system enforces accountability for access to personal information. Confidentiality also includes careful handling of data in test and development environments, because copying production data into less controlled environments is a common privacy failure. Applying integrity and confidentiality end-to-end means you think about protection in every environment, every transfer, and every stage of the life cycle. Accountability is the principle that ties everything together because it turns good intentions into provable behavior. Accountability means the organization can demonstrate it follows its privacy principles through documented decisions, assigned responsibilities, and operational records. The exam often tests accountability by asking what evidence should exist, who should approve decisions, and how oversight works across vendors and internal teams. Accountability also means privacy is not optional or informal, because if responsibility is unclear, privacy work becomes inconsistent and collapses under pressure. A practical view of accountability includes policies that define rules, procedures that define how rules are carried out, training that ensures people know how to act, and monitoring that checks whether actions match expectations. It also includes having a process for handling exceptions, because real systems sometimes require trade-offs, and the exam wants you to document and justify those trade-offs rather than hide them. Accountability is also connected to leadership support and culture, because without cultural support, controls exist only on paper. When you apply accountability end-to-end, you are building a privacy program that can survive audits, incidents, and organizational change. To apply these principles end-to-end, it helps to think in life cycle stages, because principles can look different depending on whether you are collecting data, using it, sharing it, storing it, or deleting it. At collection, transparency and minimization are often primary, because you decide what to ask for and how to explain it. During use, purpose limitation, consent alignment, and access controls become central, because you decide how data is processed and who can touch it. During sharing, accountability, contractual limits, and confidentiality become central, because you must ensure recipients only use data appropriately and safeguard it. During storage, retention, integrity, and confidentiality become central, because you must protect data and avoid keeping it longer than needed. During deletion or disposal, accountability and correctness become central, because you must ensure the action actually happened and did not leave hidden copies in places like backups or derived datasets. The exam will often pick one stage and ask you to act, but the best answers reflect awareness that privacy outcomes depend on the whole life cycle. As a beginner, you can improve quickly by practicing one simple habit. Whenever you see a scenario, imagine the data life cycle behind it and ask which principles are being strained at that point. As we close, remember that privacy principles are not decoration. They are decision rules that help you design, operate, and defend systems that handle personal information responsibly. Privacy by design is the habit of embedding privacy early and maintaining it throughout the life cycle, while consent and transparency focus on informed choice and avoiding surprise by aligning communications with real processing. Purpose limitation and minimization keep data handling appropriate and restrained, while accuracy, integrity, and confidentiality ensure the data is reliable and protected in ways that prevent harm. Accountability is the principle that turns all the others into demonstrable practice through ownership, documentation, and evidence that controls operate as intended. The CDPSE exam rewards you when you can recognize which principle applies, choose actions that make it real, and connect those actions to system behavior and proof. If you practice speaking each principle as both a definition and a practical decision pattern, you will be able to navigate exam scenarios with clarity and speed. That end-to-end mindset is what transforms privacy principles from abstract concepts into a workable discipline you can apply consistently under pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.